Thinking back on what first drew me to Indian music, I remember watching videos of Ravi Shankar such as this, and not only being fascinated by his playing, but also wondering what it must feel like to be able to play sitar at that level. Was it truly as blissful as he made it seem? If so, what made it feel this way? And was there any chance I could experience something similar? After spending several years listening to Indian classical music and asking myself these kind of questions, I eventually decided to learn the sitar and carry out a PhD research on this topic. So, 10 years later, I would like to share with you some of my thoughts and research findings relating to these questions and ultimately to the deeper question of how Indian classical music might affect human consciousness. Before continuing, I would like to clarify a few things. First of all, my focus here is in understanding how Hindustani music affects performers' conscious states, which is what interests me the most. Although this music can also have a profound effect on listeners, the quality of their experience is inevitably going to be different and arguably less powerful, simply on account of the more passive role of the listener in contrast to the more active role of the performer. Because of this particular focus on the performer, my analysis will revolve primarily around the process of making musical sound rather than hearing musical sound, although obviously these two facets are closely intertwined. The second thing I would like to clarify is that although this series is about Hindustani music, it seems clear to me that many other forms of music making can also have a profound effect on human consciousness, which I think is ultimately why every culture on earth makes music. I also think that many of the underlying reasons why music might have such a powerful effect on the human mind are the same or very similar regardless of genre. Having said so, I also think that Indian classical music is particularly effective at producing certain kinds of conscious states for two main reasons. The first reason is that this music is deeply embedded within a culture which, perhaps more than any other, sees spiritual transcendence as the ultimate goal of human existence, and more importantly, sees sound in general and music in particular as valid paths for achieving this enlightened state. As Ravi Shankar explained in his autobiography, our tradition teaches us that sound is God, nada Brahma. That is, musical sound and the musical experience are steps to the realization of the self. We view music as a kind of spiritual discipline that raises one's inner being to divine peacefulness and bliss. Thus, through music, one can reach God. The fact that this music is both learned and performed within a cultural environment which sees music as a valid path towards some kind of self-transcendence is inevitably going to affect musicians' mindsets and predispositions towards experiencing something profound while performing. The other reason why I think Indian classical music might be particularly effective at producing certain kinds of conscious states has to do with this music's improvisational nature, which I hope to show allows for certain kind of creative processes, social interactions, and shared musical experiences which I feel are less accessible in non-improvisational genres. The spontaneous and somewhat unpredictable nature of Hindustani music is, I think, fundamental in shaping what it feels like to perform in this genre, both in spiritual and more mundane ways. The last thing I'd like to say here is that this is simply my own view on this matter, and I'm very interested in finding out how other people think about these issues. So if there's anything you'd like to share, please go ahead. I should also warn you that I've necessarily had to avoid going into certain topics simply in order not to make this video any longer than it already is. So if you feel that I've missed something that's really important to you, this is probably the reason why. The question of how music affects consciousness is both highly complex and multifaceted, and can therefore be approached through many different disciplines and perspectives. One possible approach could be to study what the Indian philosophical and religious texts say on the matter of sound and consciousness. Another approach could be looking at how musicians' brains and neurons behave while performing. These are both fascinating perspectives which I hope to explore in more detail in the future. However, the main approach throughout my PhD research, and the one I will be adopting in this video, is to look at these questions from a phenomenological perspective. Let me briefly explain what I mean by this. Phenomenology is usually defined as a branch of Western philosophy which aims at understanding and describing the invariant structures and conditions of human experience. The goal in phenomenology is to try suspending all preconceptions of what reality might be like and instead focus on how reality presents itself to us. By identifying, describing, and analyzing these repeatable patterns, phenomenologists then develop theories regarding the nature of human consciousness, selfhood, and social interaction. Phenomenology is sometimes argued to be the closest philosophical tradition in the West to the more introspective philosophical traditions that characterize Eastern philosophy, as both not only place experience at the center of their investigation, but also argue that a true understanding of the external objective world necessarily requires an understanding of how that world is presented and constructed through subjective conscious experience. As someone interested in understanding how Indian music affects human consciousness, I think we need to start by looking at how performing this music actually feels like, suspending both personal and cultural preconceptions. In other words, while Indian music definitely has a reputation for having a strong, sometimes spiritual impact on performers' and listeners' states of consciousness, we should nevertheless ask ourselves to what extent is this really true? And if it is true, then exactly in what way is it true? And more importantly, how can we find out? This last question brings us to the one fundamental problem with studying human consciousness, which is that it can only ever be truly grasped from the first-person subjective perspective. Basically, I can only ever truly access my own conscious states. Therefore, in order to explore the nature of subjective experience and music's impact on human consciousness, there are only two possible sources: the more direct source of self-reflection and the more indirect source based on other people's descriptions of their own experiences. Throughout this research, I relied on both accounts. Essentially, the way I collected data involved, firstly, reflecting on my own personal experience as a sitar player, secondly, interviewing various professional Hindustani musicians both in India and the UK, and then thirdly, searching for quotes and clues on how some of the greatest masters in this genre describe their own peak experiences. I then combine these various reports in search for common patterns and recurrent themes, and analyze them according to various phenomenological concepts I'll be introducing shortly. Two of my main informants throughout this research have been my sitar guru Debashish Sanyal and my singing guru Dr. Ashish Jaisawal. I would also like to mention two great friends and musicians, Dr. Shyam Rastogi and Dr. Sandeep Rao, who were also very helpful throughout my research. While we're on the topic of phenomenology, I would like to introduce some important phenomenological concepts which I will be using throughout the actual analysis. The first of these concepts is embodiment, which can be summarized as the idea that perception, emotion, and cognition are all fundamentally embodied processes. In other words, everything we experience is experienced with and through our body. Or to put it in phenomenological terms, embodiment is an invariant property of how we experience both the world and ourselves. The embodied nature of human perception, emotion, and cognition is particularly evident in the context of musical performance, where musicians must literally think and feel through their ears, hands, mouths, throats, and ultimately through their entire musicking bodies. Therefore, if we wish to understand how music affects human consciousness, we must start by taking a close look at the musician's embodied behavior while performing and consider what sets it apart from non-musical contexts. The second of these concepts is intentionality, which essentially means goal-oriented action. Playing music is a clear example of intentional behavior, as most actions are carried out on purpose with a particular goal in mind. When two or more musicians perform together, their separate intentions must come together around some kind of common goal. In other words, they need to establish what cognitive psychologists refer to as shared intentionality and group agency. This involves both agreeing on the general outline of the performance as well as adapting to each other's individual intentions as they emerge and evolve while performing. Dissecting how intentionality operates across various levels of a performance, both individually and socially, can give us a better picture of what these experiences feel like and why they feel the way they do. The third and most important phenomenological concept I would like to introduce here is the idea that human consciousness can be broadly divided into two distinct levels, a reflective level and a pre- or non-reflective one. Our reflective level of consciousness is the level upon which we engage in verbal communication, planning, and abstract thought. It is the part of ourselves which projects itself into the past and future, and which often manifests itself as a voice in our heads, which is constantly narrating, analyzing, and judging what is happening to us. Typically, when people think of what defines their self, they think of personal aspects which exist on this level of consciousness, such as their name, their memories, their beliefs, their tastes, and accomplishments. It is therefore, from a phenomenological perspective, the level of consciousness upon which our sense of ego predominantly resides. However, underneath this level of consciousness exists another pre-reflective level, which is non-verbal and which exists solely in the present moment. This level of consciousness is rooted in the embodied action and sensation of the here and now. It is intuitive, habitual, and much more directly responsible for carrying out daily tasks and ultimately ensuring our physical survival. Although this aspect of ourselves supports and allows for egoic behavior, it is in essence non-egoic in nature, as it lacks any awareness of the self beyond the present moment. To understand the difference between reflective and pre-reflective consciousness, imagine a situation where you're taking a walk through the park. At first, the path is smooth, so you manage to walk while paying almost no attention to where you're stepping. While this is happening, your mind is busy thinking about things that have nothing to do with the task of walking. However, gradually the path becomes muddier and you begin to pay more attention to where you step, making a more conscious effort not to slip. At one point, the path becomes so muddy you need to stop, analyze the situation, imagine alternative scenarios where you either continue walking down the same path or turn around and find a different path, and eventually decide which option is best. In phenomenological terms, you went from experiencing the walk in a pre-reflective manner to experiencing it in a highly reflective one. Similarly, in a musical context, some actions are carried out more reflectively than others, and trying to identify the degrees of reflection involved can offer us a window into the mind of the musician while performing. Throughout this investigation, the first fact which I was constantly faced by, both in my conversations with other musicians and through my own sitar practice, was that the quality of one's experience as a performer is fundamentally tied to one's technical and musical ability. As Shyam put it, it fully depends upon capacity. Simply picking up a sitar without knowing how to play it is unlikely to affect your state of mind in any significant way. One must spend years practicing in order to gradually access and nurture these experiences. It is a lifetime achievement, as my guru Debashish Sanyal often reminds me, and the depth of one's own experience while performing is directly related to this lifetime dedication. Becoming a musician involves training the body over many years to do certain things, certain highly precise patterns of movements which are not a part of day-to-day experience. While on stage, musicians become, in a very real sense, entirely different people. They act, feel, and think in ways which are different to normal non-musical experience, and this physical, emotional, and cognitive transformation is the basis upon which music affects their conscious states. Ethnomusicologist Matthew Rahim describes this transformation beautifully in his book Musicking Bodies. The special quality of a body in music is easiest to see when it comes alive at the beginning of a performance. When a singer begins to sing, confidently adopting a familiar posture, forming her jaw and tongue into resonant shapes, tracing melody in the air with her hands, it is as though some entirely different person has replaced the person who was there a moment before. The musicking body may seem to disappear while chatting on a train or riding a bike, but it springs to life again in concerts, in practice, and in lessons. Through this physical and cognitive transformation, the musician adopts a distinct mode of being, which, as Rahim points out, is passed down from generation to generation through what is referred to as the Guru Shishya Parampara, or teacher-student lineage. This distinct mode of being, which is grounded in the musicking body, is not only defined by particular actions and behaviors, but also by the thought processes which guide these musical actions. So, how does a musicking body think? To answer this question, let's consider the process by which musical skills are gradually acquired. At first, when one begins to learn an instrument, every single action requires reflective awareness. One needs to remember to place one's hands in a certain position, strum the instrument strings in a certain way, and so on. One must also reflect on different features of musical structure, such as, in the case of Hindustani music, making sure one stays within the confines of rag and tal. However, over time, and with enough practice and experience, these processes start to require less and less reflection and can eventually be carried out from a pre-reflective stance. As Debashish explained, when you're playing for 40 years, you don't need to think anything about your playing. You don't need to think about the structure. The structure is inside your blood. But if you're going to perform within 10 years of experience, it is not inside your blood. Then it is more in your mind. Then you play more by your mind, thinking, after this, I should play that. Then I will play this high. But after you play for 40 years, there is no need to think what you play. This tal, this teka, this rhythm, it is not inside my mind, it is in my blood. This same idea was apparently expressed more forcefully by Vilayat Khan to his son Shujat, who at one point reportedly asked his father to clarify what raga they were working on. Vilayat Khan's response was, "Again you're asking me, thinking. I told you not to think, none of your business, just play." This is also similar to how Ravi Shankar described his own creative process to ethnomusicologist Stephen Slawek, who writes that his sitar is no longer an external medium for producing music, but a fused part of his body, and the act of creating music is more a release of inner energy than an activity requiring conscious effort. It is important to clarify that these descriptions shouldn't be misinterpreted as suggesting that playing music is somehow a mindless activity. On the contrary, musicians are extremely mindful while performing. Indeed, one of the main reasons why music can be so enjoyable relates to this mindful quality, to being fully in the moment. However, this mindfulness is, at least in terms of the physical actions involved in playing an instrument, predominantly non-reflective in nature, in contrast to, for instance, another potentially mindful activity such as playing chess, which I suspect feels mindful on a much more reflective level. Having said so, I should clarify, I'm not saying there is absolutely no reflective thought involved in playing Hindustani music. As we shall see in the following section, reflection can often play an important part in musical performance, especially in terms of allowing for precise forms of musical interaction. However, the underlying physical and cognitive behaviors supporting these more reflective thought processes are carried out without thinking, or more precisely, pre-reflectively. To clarify what I mean, it might be helpful to think of performing as analogous to driving a car, with the pre-reflective mind sitting on the driver's seat and the reflective mind sitting on the passenger seat. In this analogy, the pre-reflective mind is the one that's actually responsible for carrying out all the physical actions involved in driving, while the reflective passenger's role can vary from being highly involved and helpful to almost entirely uninvolved and passive, as well as occasionally distracting the pre-reflective driver by talking about things that have nothing to do with the task at hand. Something similar, I think, is going on as the musician is performing, with the pre-reflective musicking body actually being responsible for doing the work, while the reflective mind assesses, gives opinions, guides, and occasionally distracts. Here, I think it is important to remember that this music is primarily improvised. After all, it is one thing to rely on the pre-reflective embodied mind to carry out actions which are highly repetitive. A rather different and much more impressive thing is to rely on the pre-reflective mind to carry out musical actions which are creative, unplanned, and novel. I'll be coming back to this idea in the final section of the analysis, as I consider it to be central in understanding some of the most powerful and transformative experiences Hindustani musicians may occasionally have. But for now, I would like to bring this section to a close by stressing that training the so-called musicking body to act, think, and even create without the need of reflective thought is what I consider to be the key to gradually unlocking the more transformative states of consciousness we will be exploring further on. So far, we've been approaching this analysis from the perspective of the individual performer. But live music performance is an inherently social activity. Music is both created and shared with others through processes of social interaction, which, as I found throughout my various interviews, often play a central role in determining both the success of a performance and the possibility of experiencing some profound change in consciousness. This means that in order to describe what a performer's musical experience feels like, we need to take its social dimension into account. Once more, there are many different ways of approaching this question. My approach here will be to look at how Hindustani musicians interact and how they describe these interactions according to the various phenomenological concepts we've been considering so far, namely embodiment, intentionality, and reflection. When two or more musicians perform together, their separate intentions and embodied behaviors must align around common goals and action plans, and this is the foundation upon which their coordinated action and social experience is based. To help illustrate this, imagine a situation where two buskers are playing independently just a few steps away from each other and therefore getting in each other's ways. After a few minutes and realizing that this isn't going to work for either of them, they decide to stop playing separately and start playing together. From an individualistic perspective, their separate actions are still essentially very similar to what they were when they were playing separately, yet their whole social experience has changed radically. What exactly is the difference from a cognitive and psychological perspective between the initial experience of detachment and potential conflict and the subsequent one of collaboration and togetherness? Well, the fundamental difference is that initially each busker was pursuing his own separate musical goals without any regard for what the other's musical goals were. Their intentions were therefore both distinct and in contradiction, as they were both essentially competing for the same sonic space. However, once they start playing together, their musical intentions now have to be aligned to some significant degree to what the other's musical intentions are. Simply put, they went from thinking in terms of I to thinking in terms of us. This ability for social cohesion and collaboration is referred to in cognitive psychology as shared intentionality and is the cognitive basis upon which joint music making is based. Now let's introduce the factor of reflection. The process just described, whereby two or more musicians align their separate musical goals and intentions, can be carried out both reflectively or pre-reflectively, with or without consciously thinking about what the other's musical intentions are. The reason why this is important to our analysis is that it plays an important role in defining what it feels like to play music with others from a social perspective. To give a simple example, imagine a situation where you're at someone's birthday party and suddenly you hear someone else start singing happy birthday. As soon as you hear this, you understand that that person's musical intention is to get everyone else to start singing happy birthday together and clap and cheer at the end. Once this is understood and you start singing, there is no longer any need to reflect on what the other person's musical intentions are. The entire musical process can be carried out automatically, without thinking. The reason why this is possible is essentially due to the simplicity and predictability involved in singing happy birthday. The tune itself is very simple, we've all sung it hundreds of times and can count on others knowing it too. There's also very little chance of anything truly unexpected happening. There's therefore both very little need and very little scope for thinking about what the other's separate musical intentions might be. In fact, we can almost forget there are other people in the room without this making much difference to the musical outcome. And yet, at the same time, the whole point of singing Happy Birthday is doing it as a group. The song isn't meant to be sung by just one person, as it is all about the feeling of togetherness and shared joyfulness that can result from singing with others, with separate voices blending into a single entity, patterns of perception and attention synchronizing around a common beat, emotional states becoming momentarily attuned, and as a result, feeling more socially connected. Of course, singing Happy Birthday is unlikely to produce any profound change in consciousness. However, the main point is that it is possible to make music with others without having to consciously think about what their separate musical intentions are, and that these pre-reflective joint musical activities can often be extremely powerful in bringing people together precisely because they help dissolve the distinction between self and other. Now let's consider the context of Hindustani music. In some basic yet important respects, the experience of playing in a Hindustani ensemble is not that different to singing Happy Birthday. In both cases, there is a sense of social cohesion and togetherness which results from being immersed in the same sonic space, synchronizing patterns of action and attention around a common beat, and being emotionally moved in similar ways. In fact, this is something which can be said of essentially all forms of joint music making, which is probably what makes music so powerful in bringing people together across cultures. However, in contrast to the birthday party scenario, where thinking about the other's intentions is both unnecessary and irrelevant, in performing Hindustani music this becomes much more important. This is mainly due to this music's complex improvisational nature, where neither musician is entirely sure of what the other musician will play at any one point. As a result, musicians need to be a lot more aware of what the other is doing, why he's doing what he's doing, and what is the best way to respond. In fact, throughout my various interviews, I often found performers would describe their musical interactions, especially their most enjoyable ones, as similar to having a conversation with a really good friend, with whom there is a good understanding and shared feelings of support and affection. For instance, this is how tabla maestro Zakir Hussain describes it.
When a musician is performing and I'm playing with him, within the first minute or two, I have to judge and analyze what this musician is feeling at the time, what he's going through, and what he's trying to express through his music, his temperament, his feelings, his emotions. And so in that sense, I'm almost a psychiatrist.
In short, what I think makes Indian classical music special is that overlaid on top of the embodied and pre-reflective feelings of social togetherness which characterize most forms of joint music making, performers are also likely to experience a sense of connection on a more reflective and communicative level, where the awareness of the other's separate thoughts, intentions, and emotions is a lot more pronounced. To conclude this video, I would like to suggest that one of the main reasons why Hindustani music can feel so good from a social perspective is that it helps channel our reflective, egoic self towards more empathic forms of social interaction and shared understanding, where we're fully aware of the other as an independent other, with his or her own thoughts, feelings, and subjective experiences, while at the same time feeling understood and supported ourselves. Connecting with the other on this communicative and empathic level seems to be, by most accounts, a crucial component in allowing Hindustani musicians to experience the more transformative states of consciousness we shall be exploring in the following video. We have now reached the central question in this investigation. How does musical performance affect performers' sense of self, especially during peak states? Is there an experiential basis to the philosophical and religious idea that God is sound and that music offers a valid path to some kind of self-transcendence? To answer this question, I'm going to be focusing on a single report by my sitar guru Debashish Sanyal, as it was the most detailed and vivid description of what a peak musical experience feels like that I was able to collect throughout my various interviews and periods of fieldwork. This particular interview was carried out just a few days after a performance of Debashish together with Sodi Dirje on tabla, which took place in Glasgow in April 2017, and which you're hearing right now. Although this is obviously Debashish's own personal and unique experience, the images and themes by which he describes it seem to me to be very representative of how other Hindustani and non-Hindustani musicians tend to describe their best and most memorable experiences. Therefore, I think that the underlying phenomenological patterns which we can extract from this one report will resonate with how other musicians tend to experience music at its peak.
When I feel very good by my playing or by the atmosphere, by the feeling, then I go so deep inside and then I just forget where I am and who I am actually there. Affecting to my body actually and in my mind. Very few times it's happened with me, but this in this concert also has happened with me. Then I go so much inside of that, and there I actually sometimes I lost myself actually. Then I just go inside, and then I don't know where I am. Then after the concert is very hard for me to make balance, and then it took me 1 hour, 2 hours to just come in the world, because we are totally in the different world at that time. When once you are inside of that, then you are totally looks like you are in a dream, and that type of things is difficult to remember, and particularly that moment where I am is so difficult for every musician to say that, because they are totally in the trance actually. And until they don't go inside this trance way of feeling, they cannot give the good feeling of the music. And also the depend on the ragas also there. The raga which you choose, these ragas also affects to you so much actually.
In what way is the creative process different to normal performances? Is there any difference there in terms of how you make your improvisation?
It is actually like a very, very free way of that. Once you are doing this free way, then it is all the things what we are playing. This is actually coming automatically. This we don't actually don't decide, and we did not think about those things, because once you are thinking what I have to play next, what I have to play next, then you cannot go inside of that. Then you will be outside of this feeling. So that is that is the experience. That is like how much knowledge you have, and how much practice you have, fluency you have in your music, how much honest you are with the music, and how much deep you are going inside the music. This is like that. This is actually like a totally automatical things. I played some things in the concert, and which I never played before. But if you ask me to do again these things, exactly maybe I cannot do this. Because at that moment, the what feeling and what energy was inside, this energy is different. This energy is, if you tell me to do the same things, I think I cannot do, because now I have in a different state of mind, and that time I have a different state of mind. That time what is coming, it is coming automatically. And this is, I think, is kind of like one way of the God-gifted things.
The first thing that stands out from this description is the sense of a powerful transformation in Devashish's experience of himself and the world around him. As he put it, I go so deep inside the music I don't know where I am and who I am. I lose myself. It looks like you're in a dream or trance. We're in a totally different world, and it takes me 1 or 2 hours to come back. He also highlights the rare and elusive nature of this experience, which has only happened a few times, yet somewhat paradoxically also states that you need to be able to enter this trance state in order to give good feelings to your music. So what is going on here? What exactly happened to Devashish's sense of self and state of consciousness during this one particular performance? And more broadly, what are the underlying phenomenological patterns defining this kind of peak musical experience? Well, the first thing I would say is that although his report might suggest a complete loss of self-awareness, or losing yourself as he put it, from a strict phenomenological perspective, I don't think this is entirely accurate. Clearly, Devashish must have kept some degree of self-awareness. Otherwise, not only would he probably find it extremely challenging, perhaps even impossible, to perform, but he would also be unable to describe how he felt. In order to describe an experience, some kind of conscious awareness of oneself and the world around us has to persist. And yet, if we take Devashish's report seriously, it is clear that some radical transformation in his sense of self has occurred. After all, it is not every day that we forget where we are or who we are, or that we feel like we're in a dream or trance while fully awake. So, if we agree that his sense of self during this performance was in some ways radically different to ordinary non-musical experience, but that this change did not involve a complete dissolution of self-awareness, then how should we interpret it? Well, my interpretation is that these peak musical experiences result from a shift in how we experience our sense of self on both reflective and pre-reflective levels. Ordinarily, in our daily lives, we tend to associate very strongly with our reflective egoic self, with that voice in our head which is constantly judging, analyzing, remembering and planning, while paying little attention to our pre-reflective embodied self. In addition, we also tend to see our body as the servant to our mind, acting according to how our mind tells it to act. However, in intense musical experiences such as these, this relationship seems to invert itself. We now associate ourselves almost entirely with our present embodied experience, allowing the music body to lead the way while our reflective egoic self, that voice in our heads, becomes either a passive observer or in extreme cases disappears altogether. To me, this seems to be exactly what Devashish is describing when he says he forgets where he is and who he is. His entire experience seems to be reduced to or confined by the present moment. The sense of losing himself in the music, I think, refers to his reflective self, to his sense of self beyond the here and now. Even his analogy to being in a dream supports this interpretation, as I'll explain in more detail in a moment. At the same time, while his reflective self appears to become more passive and perhaps even absent, his pre-reflective sense of self appears to be intensified. For a start, there is the image of immersion into musical sound, of going deep inside the music, as he put it, which implies a heightening of perceptual experience and which, as he explains, is the basis upon which this transformation in consciousness occurs. This intensification of perceptual sonic experience is essentially pre-reflective in nature. It is immediate and non-conceptual. In addition, the way in which Debashish describes the process of musical improvisation also points towards the primacy of pre-reflective experience. It is, as he put it, a very free way, automatic, without thinking, and yet crucially of a higher quality than normal. In other words, reflection seems to play little or no role in this musical process. Whereas in our ordinary lives it is usually our reflective mind which tells our body what to do, here it seems that this hierarchy is inverted. It is now the body that decides what to do while the mind follows. As Velayat Khan apparently instructed his son Shujat, where the hand is moving should not be decided by you. This is also similar to how Ravi Shankar described his own creative improvisational process when he said that you don't know what you're doing yourself, you're not planning to go to the next note. It flows, the raga and you become one. Taking agency away from the reflective mind and bestowing it on the pre-reflective musicking body is, I think, the key to this whole experience. It is what turns the ego into a passive observer and reconnects us with a deeper, more impersonal aspect of our own selves. Having said so, it is important to stress that in order for this transformation to be effective, the musical outcome needs to be perceived as more expressive, technically accomplished, and of an overall higher quality than usual. If, on the contrary, the musical outcome is perceived as poor, then this is actually more likely to reinforce the ego's sense of importance, of having to be in more control and better prepared for next time. If, without thinking, one manages to play and improvise more effectively and creatively, then the ego is kind of forced into, or at least allowed to, adopt a more passive role. In addition, I think there is one more element which is also crucial for this experience to occur, which is a certain degree of musical novelty. This next part of the analysis is the most personal and speculative, so it'd be very interesting to know what other people think and whether you agree with me or not. For me, in order to feel ecstatic through my own playing, in order to feel a sense of connection with some deeper non-egoic source of creativity, I need to be to some extent surprised by my own playing. If I improvise in a non-reflective manner, but in doing so I simply end up repeating old patterns, then my attention tends to wander off and nothing truly exceptional happens. I need to feel as though I'm playing things which I have never done before, at least not quite in the same way. This also seems to be an important component in Debashish's own description, as he admits that in his concert he plays certain things which he might not be able to replicate, as his state of mind is no longer the same. I think there are two main phenomenological reasons behind the importance of novelty in bringing about these kind of altered musical experiences. The first is that by playing things which the reflective mind cannot fully anticipate, it emphasizes the ego's position as a mere observer, becoming, in a sense, as surprised by what is happening as the listener might be. The second reason is that by playing things which the musician has never played before, it strengthens the feeling that the creative energy is emanating from some deeper, non-personal, perhaps even divine source. It feels like something which is given to us rather than controlled by us, or as Debashish put it, a gift from God. Lastly, I would like to close this section by going back to Debashish's dream analogy. it strikes me that this kind of peak musical experience is in fact very much like a dream, in the strict phenomenological sense that both experiences allow us to tap into a non-egoic source of creativity, which can greatly surpass reflective, wakeful creativity in its novelty and inventiveness, and where our sense of self is still present but radically transformed. To conclude this video, I would like to return to the 3 questions posed at the start. Namely, are these musical experiences truly as blissful as someone like Ravi Shankar might make them seem? If so, then what makes them feel this way? And is it at all possible for someone like me to experience them too? So, to answer the first question, although at this point we will never know exactly what did Ravi Shankar feel while performing, we can find out what other living Hindustani musicians feel and infer from that that he must have experienced something along similar lines, although perhaps more intensely. Based on all the data that I was able to collect throughout my research as well as my own personal experience as a sitar player, it seems clear to me that Hindustani musicians do occasionally experience something which could be described as blissful. Though rare and elusive, these blissful experiences are, as far as I can tell, real. In this respect, I fully agree with musicologists David Clark and Tarakini, who, after conducting a similar survey, concluded the following. We do not assert that every Indian classical music performance is marked throughout by a state of transcendental consciousness on the part of performers and audiences. Yet, a fundamental motivation for all involved remains the possibility of momentarily touching a higher state of consciousness. On some level, these experiences are real, they make a claim to truth. So, after all this research, as I look back to these early Ravi Shankar videos and try to decide whether he may have actually been experiencing some kind of blissful state, my conclusion is that he must have at least experienced it once in a while, and it is very likely that the possibility of experiencing some kind of blissful state permeated his entire approach to music. Moving on to the next question. What makes these rare but real blissful experiences feel this way? Well, in summary, what I think makes musical experiences blissful on a phenomenological level is the empowerment of the pre-reflective music body, combined with a decrease in egoic control, where the reflective mind is either redirected towards more empathic forms of social interaction or silenced altogether. In order to achieve this, musicians need to spend many years training their music bodies to act and create without thinking. It also helps if the performance takes place within the right social environment, with performers feeling mutually understood and supported. Lastly, I think that the ability to fully let go and allow the music to take its own course into potentially uncharted territory strengthens the sense of connection with some deeper non-egoic source, especially when the results feel novel and surprising. Whether this felt connection with some deeper non-egoic creative source is actually the manifestation of some divine entity, or simply the result of neurological, physiological, and cultural conditioning is not up to me to decide. However, what I can say based on this research is that the experience itself is real, and at least for me, that is enough. This brings me to the final question in this video. Can someone like me, who picked up the sitar relatively late in life, who doesn't have a deep personal connection with Indian culture, and who isn't necessarily all that spiritual or religious, experience something similar to what Ravi Shankar may have experienced? Well, after 10 years of studying the sitar, I can happily say yes, definitely. Although my personal experience might not be at the same level of intensity as what my guru Devashish describes, and presumably even less to what Ravi Shankar may have experienced, almost every time I pick up the sitar, in a mindful and dedicated manner, I do experience some change in my conscious state, and occasionally that change can feel quite blissful. I would therefore like to end this video by emphasizing that this kind of experience is available for anyone willing to put the time and effort into it. The amazing thing about music in general and Indian music in particular is that it offers a realistic and accessible path to these highly enjoyable, transformative and meaningful experiences. As Devashish warned me, it might take a lifetime to achieve, but one does get glimpses along the way. And anyway, the path to this goal can in itself be a great source of enjoyment and personal growth. All it takes is that you approach it with love and dedication. And if you don't believe me, just try it for yourself.